Atlas on the Astro Imaging channel. I'd like to welcome you back this Sunday night. Glad you're not watching Game of Thrones. I hear we're competing with Game of Thrones, so I'm glad you're here instead. Tonight, Charles Bracken will be with us, and he's going to be telling us about how to pick the ideal nights to image, and what to image on what particular night. We've got some announcements about a processing workshop that we're going to be having, where we've got data for you that Eric Coles has donated, and you guys can all sign up on the oh no, you don't have to sign up. You just download the files, and after you've downloaded the files, you process them up as well as you can, and you send them in and submit them. And we'll show you how to do all that a little bit later. And after you've done that, we'll go through them, and we're gonna pick a few people to we're gonna ask them to come on the Astro Imaging channel and explain how they processed it, why they made the decisions they made. Remember when Adam Block was here a little while back? Adam was telling us how you have to tell a story, and we might ask you, like, what story were you telling? Even if the only story you were telling was, how do I get this to look good? But at any rate, whatever you're going to be doing, that's coming up in June is the show, but the data is already out on the website. We'll talk about that in a little while. But tonight, Charles Bracken is going to be with us. And Charles, are you ready to take over? Charles?
I am, yes. Sorry,
okay.
I had to unmute myself.
Wake up. Mesmerizing voice, put you right.
Sorry, I was watching Game of Thrones. I was.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So let me just share my desktop here. And can you guys see that okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
All right. Okay. So one thought for the title of my presentation tonight was Practical Spherical Astronomy for Astrophotographers, but if competing with Game of Thrones wasn't bad enough, that probably would turn off a lot of people. So, so let's nix that, and then maybe it's something more like spherical astronomy. I did it, so you don't have to. I wouldn't wish it upon anybody to have to do too much of this, but also that doesn't have the same ring to it. So yes, indeed, we're back to finding the optimal nights to image an object, and that's what we're going to explore tonight. The factors that go into that, and I'd like to introduce a concept of quality imaging hours, and show off some of the calculations I've done in some of my recent books. So a little bit about me. I started imaging back in 2010. I was on this channel in 2016 about signal and noise, and I haven't been back for quite a while, mainly because I spent the past couple of years living in the UK, just outside of London, and so that got me thinking, because there's plenty of time to think when you're not imaging. It's quite cloudy there most of the year. I was a bit surprised by that, but I thought that I was going to get really long winter nights for imaging. And even if it wasn't cloudy, I was fairly disappointed by the amount of darkness that I got. And so I started thinking about this, and I guess the question that I started with was, what is exactly the optimal time of year to image an object? And what if we could chart how many hours of time you have when the object is in the sky and it's positioned well? I'll call those quality imaging hours. What if you could create a chart for an object for every day of the year, and then you could plan out your imaging? Or if it's suddenly clear and it hasn't been for a while, you can look up what's best positioned tonight. And I think we all have an informal way of doing this, but I wanted to take a bit more quantitative approach. And I think you'll find that along the way, I came upon a few, at least minor surprises or counterintuitive things from this. So I've got a few different sections here. So I'll pause along the way, and Alex, you can interrupt me if questions are coming in on the chat. But in this first section here, I'd like to just discuss what's required to image an object. So obviously, you're going to have clear skies. The sky is going to have to be fully dark. The object that you want to image needs to be in the sky long enough that it's worth bothering, right? If it's just going to peak above the horizon for a little while, then it's really not worth your time. And speaking of the horizon, it needs to get well above the horizon. Imaging close to the horizon, as most of us have probably tried, doesn't usually turn out very well. And then the moon should either be not in the sky, or hopefully it's a thin moon, or even a quarter moon, depending on whether you're narrowband imaging and how far away the object is. So there's also some local stuff. So I know some people have one side of the sky that's blocked for them, or light pollution that's coming from a city that's off to the west or something like that. But I'd say that of all these requirements, the first and the last we can't really deal with here, right? So the weather's not in our control, unless you move to the Atacama Desert or something. And anything local, that's just a given for your site. So let's focus in on the 4 that remain. So fully dark skies, object in the sky long enough, object positioned high enough, and then the moon phase. So what drives these things? So for the sky to get fully dark, the position of the sun is determined by your latitude and the date. For the object's position on a given date and how long it spends in the sky, that's primarily determined by its right ascension. Its declination actually is what determines how high it can get in the sky. And then obviously, look, the moon kind of is what it is, but it's on a 29.5-day cycle. And so we can work with that as needed. So let's go into each of these. So these kind of form the 4 main parts of my presentation. And then I've got a 5th where we're going to kind of bring it all together. So let's look at latitude. This is a series of charts, and I've chosen 3 cities that are about 10 degrees apart. So you got Houston at right about 30 degrees latitude, New York at right about 40, and London a little above 50. And what I've done is the x-axis is the year, starting January 1st, going all the way to December 31st. And the y-axis starts around 3 p.m. and goes until 9 a.m. the next morning as you move upward. So what you see, the big dark blobs, are the number of hours of darkness from sunset to sunrise on that date. And I think most people are probably pretty familiar with this. If you're tuning into this channel, you have some sense of basic spherical astronomy, or at least some intuitive sense. And this was mine as well. So I was coming from the New York latitude, around 40 degrees north, and I was moving for a couple of years to London at about 50. And I knew that my summer nights were going to get shorter, and my winter nights were going to get longer. So in my head, I thought, hey, this is going to be great. I will get extra imaging hours in the winter, and that'll make up for the time that I've lost in the summer. So boy, am I excited to dedicate a lot of time to some of those great winter showpiece objects like Orion and everything in that whole area of the sky. But as you know, sunset is not the beginning of darkness. So we talk about sunset and sunrise in terms of a twilight. So there are 3 different grades of twilight. Let's work with sunset. So the sun is moving downward here. But when the sun is between 0 and 6 degrees below the horizon, we call that civil twilight. When it's between 6 and 12 below the horizon, that's nautical twilight. And when it is from 12 to 18, we call that astronomical twilight. And then if it's below 18 by convention, that's just astronomically dark. So this is what's important for these latitudes. you can see here that I've changed the chart and I've layered in some additional information about each of these phases of twilight. So you can see that Houston is fairly consistent throughout the year. New York, the same. But something really interesting happens when you go to 50 degrees north latitude. And I've added it on here, right? So you can see sunrise, and you can see the end of civil twilight, end of nautical twilight, and then the end of astronomical twilight. And what you can see is that from about mid-May until early August, it actually never gets completely dark. It never reaches astronomical darkness at that latitude. And this was, I knew that twilight varied by latitude, but I didn't know that it was quite so severe. And I was just speaking to a friend of mine recently who is a little further north than London. And he was saying that as of a couple of days ago, that's it for full darkness for him until early fall. So if you look online and you see images produced by UK astrophotographers, I mean, these guys are going to heroic efforts. Like, it's amazing. You know, they'll cobble together a few hours here, a few hours there to produce some amazing images. It takes real dedication. However, if you're lucky enough to live closer to 30 degrees north, you know, you get a lot more opportunities there. So I want to explore just briefly why this is. So we're going to take a geocentric view, and here I sort of labeled in the number of hours, and put the frowny face here. And actually, just one side note, notice that actually it's so bad that London gets 12 hours of darkness in the middle of winter, but Houston still gets 11, right? So you're not nearly compensated for the terrible summer. But as I was saying, let's take an example here. This is like a geocentric view. So we're going to put our little blue guy here. He's standing on the surface of the Earth, and he's looking at the sky around him. And I think one of the things that most people know is that your latitude is the altitude of the celestial pole, right? So if you're at latitude 30 down in Houston, you look to the north, you should see Polaris right around 30 degrees altitude. So that also tells us that the celestial equator must be 90 degrees away. And you can see that that is our latitude offset from the zenith. And we also know that the sun crosses the celestial equator at the equinoxes. So this actually tells us that on the equinoxes, the sun should be 90 degrees minus our latitude at noon, right? So it's solar noon on the equinox. If you're in Houston, the sun should be about 60 degrees above the horizon. Now, the Earth's axis is at a 23.5 degree tilt. So that actually, in our geocentric model here, causes some variation, where at the summer solstice, it's at noon, the sun will get to be 23.5 degrees higher, and at the winter solstice, 23.5 degrees lower. And just one thing, if you're trying to do the math as you follow along here, it's important to note these maroon circles at the solstices. Those are not great circles. They don't pass through the center, and so in this geocentric model, the angles won't add up like you might intuit. So there's the winter solstice. So the sun's at 36.5 degrees in Houston, and the summer solstice, it gets all the way up to 83.5 degrees. Now, if we compare that to London, you can see London at 50 degrees north. All these angles are offset, and you can see that the slope, the angle of the sun's motion across the sky is actually a lot flatter. So that has some pretty big implications, though. So there's the summer solstice, the sun 83.5 degrees altitude in Houston, and the highest it ever gets is 53.5 in London. But if we consider what's happening to the sun when it goes below the horizon, the other side of the circle, in Houston, it's getting all the way down almost 37 degrees below the horizon, whereas in London, At the summer solstice, it only gets 16.5 degrees below the horizon. So that's not even achieving a full astronomical darkness, which recall was 18 degrees below the horizon. So this is the reason why. And you can imagine that if you extrapolate this all the way up to the poles, right? You've probably seen time-lapse photos of right near the pole where the sun basically is just skimming the horizon as it goes around, and never achieving any kind of twilight there. So this is what causes that effect, right? So you can see, again, on the summer solstice, the sun going well below the horizon in Houston, not making it fully 18 degrees under, and therefore you're not achieving full darkness in the summer. Now let's look at the winter solstice, just for comparison, right? So in the winter, the sun's not getting very high. Even in Houston, it's only 36 degrees above, but that means the sun is dipping 83.5 degrees below the horizon. Deep, deep darkness, very short twilight. Whereas in London, and I mean, if you guys know, like, you hold out your fist, and I guess that's about 10 degrees at arm's length. The sun barely gets 2 fists above the horizon in the middle of winter in London, and yet still doesn't get super, super far below the horizon at night. And so you get the effect here, which we just talked about, which is that at the winter solstice, Houston is getting 11 hours of darkness, whereas London's only getting an additional hour. So that's a lot about latitude and its effect on twilight. But how far does the sun have to get below the horizon for you to actually start imaging? So that's the question that I first wanted to answer here. I'm going to arbitrarily say about 12 degrees below the horizon. That's the threshold I've set for a couple of reasons, and that's the beginning of astronomical twilight. There actually aren't a ton of great data on how dark it actually gets as the sun goes further below the horizon. The 12 and 18 degrees are fairly arbitrary historical standards that were set. But I want you to look at the chart on the right, which is from the paper cited at the bottom. So this is at the European Southern Observatory at Paranal in Chile. And so that's about the most light pollution-free place on Earth that you could go. And what they did was they measured the sky brightness this is the V band. They measured it in all the bands, but I've chosen the V band to be the center of the spectrum here. And you can see that it gets darker and darker. And here's where you hit the sun at 12 degrees below the horizon. And here's 18. And you can see that actually, even in the Atacama Desert, by about 15 degrees below the horizon, it's as dark as it's going to get. So no need to wait in most cases, I think, until the sun is at a full astronomical darkness at minus 18. Further, most places are not the Atacama Desert, and we all deal with light pollution. And light pollution, at least empirically, seems to become the dominant source of light around this negative 12 spot. That's going to vary by how bright your light pollution is, but even at the zenith, you're not likely, if you have light pollution, to get much darker than that. And then finally, a little bit of sky glow is not the end of the world for narrowband imaging, certainly, but also for certain object types. So for globular clusters and open clusters where the light is highly concentrated, it's not ideal, but you can actually do fairly well with processing out some of that sky glow. So latitude, in essence, to summarize there, determines the length of your night and the length of your twilight. And that's because latitude is determining where the sun is on a given day. So that's the first part. Let me pause here. Alex, or anybody on the line, any questions about the first part?
No, you're doing fine. Where everybody's listening pretty intently, it looks like, all except for the ones that we lost to Game of Thrones. By the way, I don't actually know when Game of Thrones is on. Somebody at the start party yesterday said, "Hey, are you losing anybody to the Game of Thrones?" And I just thought I'd mention that. No, so we're doing fine.
Okay.
And remember that we've got both Google Chat going, or the Rumble Talk chat going on our regular website. And I believe Tolga is already monitoring the YouTube chat. So if you're typing in there, we do want people to start using the YouTube chat now and then for at least an experiment to see how it compares to Rumble Talk. And if Rumble Talk is offering us no great advantage, we can cut some expenses here, because I mean, it does cost some money to run this show. So at any rate, take off, Charles. You've got it again.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, so let's move on to right ascension. So first, let's just pause to define right ascension. You've certainly noticed that right ascension it's measured in hours and minutes instead of degrees, and that allows us to match the apparent motion of the stars across the sky. So a given line of right ascension will move in time with the Earth's rotation. But since there's no pole to work as a 0 point, it's similar to the prime meridian on the globe. You have to arbitrarily choose a 0 point. So this has been chosen for right ascension as the point where the sun crosses the celestial equator as it's moving northward. And this happens at the spring equinox. So in the image here, the sun will be moving from the lower right up to the upper left, and it's crossing the celestial equator right there, and we call that's the 0 point for 0 hours. Now, if you think about it for 1 second, if the sun on this day is at right ascension 0, objects that are opposite the sun, so as the sun is on the other side of the Earth, objects on the opposite side are high in the sky in the middle of the night, those must be at 12 hours right ascension. So these are objects that are going to cross the meridian at midnight on the spring equinox. So that's 12 hours. So we can call that, it's called the date of midnight transit or midnight culmination for a given line of right ascension. So essentially, it's like asking what line of right ascension is opposite the sun today. And so wherever the sun is right now, that line of right ascension, you can rest assured in the middle of the night will be directly overhead. And that's a really good start at estimating the best time to start imaging an object. And I think this is kind of the intuitive sense we get. We know that, hey, in springtime, I'm going to be imaging objects right around, 10 or 12 hours of right ascension. They're in good position at that time. But actually, it can be a little more complicated than that. But I wanted to show here, so this is an illustration I created for the Astrophotography Sky Atlas. And you can see along the bottom, what I've done is I've marked the x-axis for the whole sky in terms not only of hours of right ascension, but in terms of sort of that ideal date, that midnight transit date. And I've drawn a line here for April 1st. So we can just pick April 1st and say, okay, April 1st, everything along the line of about 12 and a half hours is opposite the sun on that day. And because I've written some software that allows me to create these maps and do some of the calculations, I had it crank away for a little while and literally calculate every square degree in the sky and ask on April 1st from 40 degrees north latitude, how long is that spot visible in the sky such that it's a reasonable height above the horizon? And this is what you get. So indeed, it's perfectly centered on April 1st on 12 and a half hours right ascension. And you can see that the Coma cluster and Canis and the Big Dipper are all right in that line. And these numbers here indicate how many hours of good viewing you get for a given spot in the sky. And you can see that, you're really centered on this area. But, hey, if you wanted to image something over closer to, Sagittarius, you could probably still squeeze 5 hours out of it on the 1st of April. Now, that's important because in spring, that's galaxy season, right? That is the point when the line of right ascension that's best positioned like that is the line that is looking, at least in the northern hemisphere, away from our galaxy. So you're not looking into the galaxy and all its dust and stars. You're looking away from it. And that's when we see all the other galaxies out there, or at least the ones that we can see. So what I've done here, and this is also from the Astrophotography Sky Atlas, is I've plotted all of the galaxies greater than 5 arc minutes on their longest measurement. And you can see that the vast majority of them are right there, perfectly positioned in view for April. And that's why spring is galaxy season. What if we wanted to look toward the center of our galaxy? So that would be looking toward Sagittarius. And that line of right ascension is right around 18.5. So that's well positioned on July 1st. So what I've done here is you can see the plane of the Milky Way, and I've plotted everything else of the galaxies, right? So all the globular clusters, open clusters, emission nebula, reflection nebula, planetary nebula, all of that are plotted here, and you can see how they lie in the plane of the galaxy, our galaxy. And so if you're not imaging galaxies, this is probably what you want to look for. And you can even see that towards Sagittarius, right? You can see all the globular clusters because those all tend to cluster close around the center part of our galaxy. So what does it look like on July 1st if you say, ask the computer what's in the sky for how long? So here, again, you can see that it's centered on the best view and the most time in the night sky from 40 degrees north on the 1st of July is indeed centered on 18.5 hours. But what's interesting is you can see, hey, look, even at 40 degrees north, the sky is not dark as long. And so you're getting only about 6 hours of good visibility for the best part of the sky. That's just because the night is shorter. And if you'll recall, even in April, we said, hey, if you looked over towards Sagittarius, you might be able to get 4 or 5 hours out of April. So that says that, objects in the Sagittarius line of right ascension are probably visible for a good part of the year, right? Because they're in the summer, it's centered here, and you get hours at this time. But in the winter, you can still see them just because the night is longer and they rotate into your field of view. So it gets a little complicated. And so again, we're thinking I'm going to have to chart all this to really see it. But it's not to say that the date of midnight transit isn't a good start. But the sunrise and sunset sunrise and sunset times are changing, and they're changing a lot of times faster than the ideal date of right ascension, which moves at about 4 minutes a day, right? So you'll recognize this as the average time the sunset gets earlier, and that's 24 hours divided by 365 days, right? So every day, the right ascension that transits at midnight gets about 4 minutes later. But the sunrise and sunset can move a lot faster than that. It also doesn't tell us anything about if I'm 10 days from the date of midnight transit, is that okay? If I'm a month away, it doesn't tell us about how an object's viewability evolves over the course of the year. So right ascension then tells us when an object spends the most time in the night sky.
Could we hold off for a second here?
Yes.
I think we got a question coming in from YouTube. Toga, do you want to take that, or you want me to read it?
I'll take it. Jeff on YouTube asks you to comment on how the summer temperatures at 30 degrees latitude affect imaging. Houston summers can be brutal.
So these are degrees of latitude, not degrees of Celsius. Yeah. So I would say, as I said at the beginning, there's nothing we can do about the weather.
Okay. And these charts that you're showing, the ones you're flipping through right now,
yes.
They're in your Astrophotography Sky Atlas? Or?
That's correct, yes. Yeah, I pulled these directly from the Atlas.
Okay, and they're there for various latitudes, etc.
Yeah. So this is the whole sky. So this isn't latitude specific, right? Yeah. But then this type thing I just custom created for this particular presentation so that we could talk about how many hours things are visible. Yeah. This is a custom job.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So right ascension determines when an object spends most of its time in the sky. So what time of year is it going to be present? Now let's look at declination. So declination determines how long an object appears in the sky basically every day. So what I mean by that is ignoring day and night. There are circumpolar objects, right? So there are objects that are close to the pole that are up there just going around, and those are visible to you all night. And if there weren't an atmosphere here, they'd be visible to you all day. They never set below the horizon is the point. There are also objects at the other side of the celestial equator that are just, if you're here in the northern hemisphere, those are the objects way down in the south, and those are the objects that barely rise above the horizon. So that, again, is determined by the declination relative to your latitude. So what is that relationship between your latitude and the declination of an object and how high it gets in the sky? So let's take an example. Let's pick an object that's, say, 15 degrees north latitude. And let's say, again, that we're in Houston at 30 degrees north latitude. That object, so one way to think about this is you can use the celestial equator as your benchmark, right? So you say, okay, I know the celestial equator, if I'm at 30 degrees north, that means celestial equator is 90 degrees minus 30. It's at about 60 degrees in the sky. And if this object is at 15, I can count back up 15 and say, all right, so that object is going to be at about 75 degrees altitude at its highest. So the maximum altitude, there's the formula. It's 90 degrees minus the absolute value of the difference between declination and your latitude. And that does indeed bear out to 75. And a classic example of this, though, is a really beautiful object that's way in the south and you really want to image it. And for me, I've always wanted to image Omega Centauri. So here I am, I'm at about 40 degrees north, and you can do the math and say, okay, Omega Centauri is at about 47.5 degrees south declination. So that means it's going to get to about 2.5 degrees above the horizon. Now, I'm never actually going to be able to see Omega Centauri. That would be down in the trees somewhere, but I thought it simulated at least, so I turned on Stellarium and had it do this for me. And yes, indeed, I am at 40.5 degrees north. And there at the bottom, that red arrow is pointing. Even Stellarium decided to hide it down in the trees and the haze. And I thought this was interesting. So Omega Centauri, for me, at its best point, at its highest, is getting to right there. But I'd also like to note Stellarium did something interesting here with the red arrow in the upper left. It said, hey, that's magnitude 5.3, but when it's sitting that close to the horizon, it is extincted to magnitude 7.6. So that is over 2 magnitudes lower. So that's something like nearly a factor of 10 less bright than it would be if it were at the zenith. So that brings up the question of how low can you go? How low should you be looking in the sky and expecting to be able to get at least some decent imaging? So if you look straight up, you are looking through what we call one air mass. So that is the volume of air straight above you. If you look here at sea level and you look perfectly perpendicular to the ground out to the horizon, you're looking at approximately 40 air masses. And you can see the relationship here in the chart at the bottom. By the time you get to 30 degrees from the horizon, you're looking through 2 air masses. By the time you get to 15, you're looking at 4. And then, as you can see, it really deteriorates quickly from there. So what does this do to your image? Well, as Stellarium calculated, it, first of all, makes things a lot less bright. So just looking through all that air, some of your light is lost to scattering. And so you can see that at about 15 degrees, you can see that about half the light is gone. You can also see that that scattering happens differentially, and this is what we know is the cause of a red sunset and a red sunrise. So that differential scattering causes the color of what you're taking a picture of to change as well. So it's shifted to the red because the blue light is scattered more. Worse, differential refraction is where the light at different wavelengths is refracted differently because the air, while it doesn't have a lot of density, does have some. And when light passes through anything with any density, think of a prism, right? It will spread that light out because different wavelengths are refracted differently. And so you can see that here. And I've again marked 15 degrees, sort of a benchmark where things get pretty terrible. And this is the number of arc seconds spread across approximately the visual spectrum from 350 to 750 nanometers wavelength. You can see that you've got a pretty good spread, and that, they make prisms to correct this, but you are definitely going to get some severe chromatic aberration just from the air at that point. And then finally, turbulence is probably the worst of all of this. If all that wasn't bad enough, the seeing really gets terrible as you get down close to the horizon. And that's not something that's as easily quantified here, but know that it's bad. So,
okay.
Yep.
Choosing an altitude. Well, let's go to John's questions, and maybe you can
Sure.
tell me if they're appropriate now or later.
Okay.
John, does your latitude affect which is the best F ratio telescope? How long your exposures can be?
It does not. No. Your overall sky brightness does. If you are that determines at what exposure time you're going to be sky glow limited.
Mm-hmm.
But no, this is independent of that.
Okay, and that considering when John asked that question during your presentation, should we be exposing different, or is there a better or worser telescope? Or worse telescope, I suppose I should use proper English here. Is there a better or worse for when we're imaging down low? Should we change anything that we're doing, or just take the best shots we can?
In general, you can take the best shots you can. There is some fairly complicated math. There's been some discussions about this on cloudy nights where at the benefit of a larger telescope is greatly reduced the worse the seeing is, and seeing is worse as you go toward the horizon. So arguably, you could say that a smaller telescope would do just as well or better because it's not going to be quite as affected by seeing, but that gets pretty complicated. And I think if you were down at the level where it mattered, you probably should pick another object to image if it's that close to the horizon. But in general, the answer to his question is not really.
Yeah, take your best shot with whatever you got already.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. The picture you had of the little man standing there and looking off in the distance through 4 air masses as opposed to 1 air mass. Can you explain air mass and the density of the air compared to all the other concepts that go along with it there?
Sure. So looking straight up is the simplest, right? That's the thinnest view you can have looking through the atmosphere. You're looking through the least possible atmosphere, and by definition, that's called 1 air mass. Now, the atmosphere is not evenly distributed. It's densest closest to the Earth, and it gets progressively less dense as you go upward. Its composition is also different, but we use the benchmark of 1 air mass looking straight up, and everything else basically is an approximation. These approximations are pretty darn good until you get really close to the horizon, and then at that point, it starts to matter. Individual variations in atmospheric density start to really have an impact there. But the standard is that when you are looking out straight at the horizon, you are looking through approximately 40 air masses. That's just an order of magnitude, though. I would say everything down to about 10 degrees here using the equations that are behind this is pretty accurate. Anything below 10 degrees from the horizon, it's actually kind of hard to say how many air masses you're looking through. But like I said, if you're asking that question, you probably shouldn't be imaging there anyway.
Yeah. Well, what I always was struck with was that I think it's something like 5 times. When you're looking along the horizon, you've got to go 5 times as far to get to outer space. But
Yeah.
it's a different quality of air that you're looking through. It's much denser and more disturbed and everything else. And that's why it has the effect of 40 nominal.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point, right? So, looking at it here, like this horizontal line doesn't look to be 40 times as long, but what it is, to your point, is that you're mostly looking through that dense air that's close to the ground and less looking through, the air that's up higher and much less dense. So the effect, to your point, is looking like through 40 atmospheres.
Thank you. That's all the questions for now, right, Tolga? I think. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, we're good for now.
Great. All right, so let's set 15 degrees as the lowest you'd really, even in a pretty permissive situation, you'd ever really want to be imaging an object and expect to get quality data. So as a reminder, what's happening at 15 degrees is you've lost half of the light to extinction. The red and blue channels have been separated by about 9 arc seconds. The red channel is actually 50% brighter than the blue channel at that point. Seeing is pretty terrible, and if that wasn't worse enough, we all know that due to the light domes of cities in the distance or whatever, the light pollution is actually worse close to the horizon. So let's arbitrarily say that when an object gets above 15 degrees, that's probably when you'd be okay to start imaging it. So declination. So that closes out the declination section. Declination determines how high it gets in the sky and how long it stays there. And how high it gets in the sky is very important because we need it to be at least 15 degrees above the horizon before we probably want to start imaging it. Now, just a short section on the moon. This was a little bit harder to find data for, but I've plotted on the left here the percent of moon's illumination by phase. It follows a nice perfect sine curve here. And as no surprises, right? At a new moon, it's 0. At the quarter moon, it's 50% illuminated, and at full moon, it's 100%. But it does follow a slight curve. It's a little bit harder to quantify, though, because the moon is a unique source of light pollution in that it's moving and it's varying in brightness, and it's coming from above. So the effect of moon glow on imaging is, first of all, dependent on how close the moon is, not just its phase, but how close it is to the object that you want to image. And it actually changes over the course of a night, right? The moon is moving fast enough through the sky that actually it could be getting closer, further away from your object. And we're all familiar with probably trying to process out gradients later, right? So you've got at the beginning of your imaging run, you've got one gradient, and then the gradient is different at the end of the imaging run because the moon has shifted positions. And that's not even accounting for the fact that probably as the object's moving, it's changing relative to your other light pollution. But the moon adds another layer of complexity there. The moon's light pollution, if you'll call it that, is also dependent on how humid it is, which is like any light pollution, dust and aerosol content in the air, also like any light pollution, but it's particularly affected by snow on the ground and even foliage. So whether the leaves are on the tree, but in particular, if there's snow on the ground and the moon is shining, hitting the air once on the way down, bouncing off the ground, and then hitting it again on the way back up, that can be particularly bad. So it's worse in the winter for those of us who have snow. And then, also for some objects, a little bit of moon glow is not the end of the world. So as we discussed earlier, if you're narrowband imaging or you're looking at clusters, maybe you can still cut through it. So I couldn't set a hard and fast rule. So what I've done is I've basically said, I'm going to inform you about the moon, but ultimately it's up to you depending on what you're imaging. And the way to do this is to say either the moon is in the sky or the moon is not in the sky. And that's the simplest way to look at it. So one counterintuitive thing that I did get, so this is a chart I'll show you in more detail a little bit later, but I just wanted to show a preview of it here. So this is the x-axis is all the dates of the year. And on the y-axis are the number of good quality imaging hours for a particular object. And I've overlaid the moon phases here. This is overlaid in the book as well. And you can see the new moon is the dark circles. And you would think intuitively that, like, okay, right around the new moon is, you know, plus or minus a few days from that is the time to image. And for some objects, depending on whether they are the time of year, they might be on the east or west side of the sky, and therefore to avoid the moon, actually you want to fall a little bit closer toward first quarter sometimes, or last quarter sometimes, in order to get the most dark moonless hours. So what this chart is showing is that if you ignore the moon, the straight line is showing you, so for instance, on January 1st, this object is in the night sky for over 10 hours, and that's when it's above 15 degrees. And all of those hours are dark, but the shaded parts, those are moonless dark hours, right? So right here, for instance, February 15th, you can see that, yes, this object is getting something like 6.5 hours of time in the night sky when it's above 15 degrees, but all that time the moon is out. That whole time the moon is out, and that's why it's shaded lighter. So this is a preview of the kind of charts that we can generate once we start to combine all this information. And it does yield to some slightly counterintuitive results, which is that you would think that these periods of moonlessness would be centered on the new moon, but for a given object, the ideal time to chase it might be a little closer to one of the quarters, depending on the time of year. So the moon, right? In general, avoid it for some objects. It's okay for others. It's also dependent on your local situation. So you want to know that information.
Okay, before we head off, and I think we're about to, Linda has pointed out that these low altitudes, a one-shot color could actually be at a disadvantage due to the differential, diffraction, and just the mess around the horizon. That's
a great point, right? So that differential refraction, if you're taking one-shot color, you're actually forced to take all the colors at once. And yes, and if you do this, you'll see the stars spread out into little spectra, right? You'll see they're red on top and blue on the bottom, and you can buy prisms to offset this, but you have to adjust it as the night goes on, as the object gets closer to the horizon. So yes, one-shot color is at a disadvantage. You can get a small advantage by shooting individual color filters, right? So that's going to filter out some of that differential diffraction, and you're going to capture the object in a tighter resolution that way. So yes, that's a great point. One-shot color close to the horizon would be the worst possible combination.
Thank you. That's all the questions we've got right now.
Okay. All right. So let's bring all of this together. I said, I did the spherical astronomy, so you don't have to, and I definitely don't claim to be an expert in spherical astronomy, but was able to write the algorithms to do a lot of this math, and it helped me understand when I should be imaging. And the way I brought it all together is what I mentioned earlier, which is this idea of quality imaging hours. So based on everything we've seen so far, what I've defined that as is for any given day, how long an object is at least 15 degrees above the horizon, while the sun is at least 12 degrees below it. So that would be like the most permissive time that you could start imaging an object, is to say, okay, it's in at least halfway decent position, and it's at least most of the way dark. I can start imaging there. And then the moon is like another layer of information that we'll layer on. So what I did was, that's the whole premise behind the Astrophotography Planner, right? So this is available both as a paperback, which I'll show some details of the kind of charts that are in that, but also literally as of today, I've been working all weekend to get this ready, is that I can also create custom versions of this that are based on your exact longitude and latitude and your time zone. and I can provide a lot more pages and detailed information in a PDF rather than a printed book, and they're priced the same. So if you email me your information, send me some PayPal, I will create a custom version for you. So what I've done is I've chosen the arbitrary top 76 imageable areas. These are areas, so a lot of them have multiple objects in one tight little area. And if you were to look on AstroBin or wherever, you'd probably see that these are the majority of the objects that Northern Hemisphere imagers are chasing. And so you've probably got over 100 different objects listed here. So I've chosen those, and I've created the charts that you've seen for them. So let me just show you an example of that. So this is the Crescent Nebula, NGC 6888. And we talked earlier about the date of midnight transit. So based on its right ascension of 20 hours, right? So late July 25th is its date of midnight transit. That's when it would intuitively be best positioned in the sky. But actually, when you look at this, and the y-axis is the number of quality imaging hours for every given day. And actually, these crazy other little dotted lines are overlays for different latitudes, right? So the charts are based on 40, but if you're at 30 or 50, I've overlaid charts or dotted lines here to show what the shape of the curve is for your area. But you can see that regardless of what latitude you're at, July 25th might not be the best possible time to get the most hours in the Crescent Nebula. That actually occurs a couple of months later in September. And let's look at why that is. So there's a second type of chart provided for each object, and that looks like this. So this is a version of what we saw earlier, right? So this is the year running across the x-axis, and starting at 5 in the evening and running until 7 the next morning. You can see along the y-axis, and these are the hours of darkness. And this is not sunrise and sunset now. The shaded in area is showing when the sun is at least 12 degrees below the horizon. So it's not just naive sunrise, sunset. It's showing when it's truly dark. And you can see that on July 25th, right, I've drawn this line here, I've drawn in these diagonal lines for the rise time for the object, the transit time for the object, that's when it's highest in the sky, and the set time. So from 40 degrees north, you can see that on July 25th, the object, the Crescent Nebula, rises at 5 in the evening. You'd have to adjust that for daylight savings time, so it would actually be, I guess, be 6 for most people. So it's rising at 5 in the evening. The sun then is fully dark at what looks to be about 8:30 before daylight savings time adjustment. And at that point, it's already well in the sky. And then it doesn't set until the next morning, long after the sunrise. So it's visible the whole night long. And therefore, as the night gets longer, it actually has more and more imaging time available until you get to this point in September. And that's when it starts setting before the sun rises, or the sun gets to at least 12 degrees below the horizon, right? And that's why you see the shape of that chart. So this is where it starts to set before darkness truly ends. And that's when it starts to get fewer hours every night available to image. And so you can see, I'll go back to that chart. You can see the peak here right in September as the most possible. This is from 40 degrees north. You would be able to get almost 9 hours right around September 1st of imaging time on the Crescent Nebula. So that's a quick version of how to read the charts. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I don't see any popping up here. I don't think Tolga's got any either.
Okay, cool. So what I did was I created these charts for each of those 76 areas, showing the quality imaging hours, and I put overlays for 30, 40, and 50 degrees north latitude. You've got a chart that shows you those rise and set times, so you can start to think about what's going on. But also, I like to have that because I'm really lazy about meridian flipping my mount. And so I like to know that an object is close to the meridian about the time that I'm ready to go to bed, so I can get get it started and then just let it chase the object down toward the horizon, and I don't have to manage a meridian flip in the middle of the night. So you can use these rise, set, and transit time charts to help with that. And then I created custom charts. These are similar in format to what I did for the Astrophotography Sky Atlas, but they're centered on the object, and I put a brief description of the object as well. So this is, again, 76 areas, but these are all for Northern Hemisphere observers. And then there are separate charts for the moon for 2019 and 2020, showing the hours of darkness for each night with the time when the moon is not present shaded in. So those are your moonless dark hours, and that gives you a sense of when you want to go out and take pictures of galaxies, or you want to take broadband images of nebula. This tells you when it's going to be truly, the moon's going to be out of your way and you're going to have dark hours, and whether that's at the beginning of your night or toward the end of your night, and how long you've got for every day of the year, 2019 to 2020. Okay. And then that's the print book. So that if you want a custom version of this, I can base it on your longitude and latitude. And actually that allows me to declutter the charts a little bit without some of the other stuff for different latitudes other than yours. And I can incorporate the moon into the actual charts. So this is similar to what I showed you earlier, where, for instance, you can see that for this object, so again, this is the Crescent Nebula, and this I calculated for 51 degrees north for, I think actually this is 41 degrees, I think that's a typo, but this is mid-April, and you can see that in mid-April, look, you can get 4 or 5 hours of the Crescent Nebula, and it's completely moonless. You can get 5, even 6 hours maybe in late April, but the moon is going to be in your way. So that's shaded lighter just to show. And you can look on any given day and determine how many total hours you're going to get of quality imaging hours, and then how many are moonless. It also allows you to create a custom chart for your longitude and latitude, where I can show you all 76 objects and how they lay out across the year. So this is like really allowing you to plan what you want to image when, and see the objects that are nearly circumpolar for you. So for instance, I'm sure it's too small to see here, but you can see right here that's M81 and M82. So that's got a really high latitude, or declination, sorry. And therefore, it's circumpolar. So you can see it's visible or imageable throughout the year, but you can definitely tell that in winter, that's the time you're going to get the most hours, because it's shaded darker, where you get more hours of quality imaging time for that given object. So just to summarize, so what have we talked about here? We've talked about latitude, and that determines basically the position of the sun, which determines how many hours it's going to be dark where you are. And we've chosen 12 degrees below the horizon as the point. That's the beginning of astronomical twilight, and you can probably safely start imaging. Once the sun's at about -15, it's really not going to get any better than that for most people. And actually, for most people, if you have a lot of light pollution, it stopped getting good for you around 12 below the horizon. And I also learned that while the sunset and sunrise definitely change by latitude as you go north, you actually don't get any more imaging hours in the winter to compensate you for those that you lose in the summer. So being in the mid-latitudes, a little closer to the equator, is actually a lot better for the sheer number of hours available to you to image. Right ascension determines what time of the year an object spends the most time in the sky. And we talked about the date of midnight transit and how that's a good starting point, but it's not always the best date to image an object. And we also showed, for instance, why spring is galaxy season, because it is determined by the date of midnight transit for the objects around that date are positioning you to look either toward the center of our galaxy or away from our galaxy, and therefore revealing different objects. Declination determines how high an object gets in the sky, and we discussed why you really shouldn't be imaging. I mean, take your chances, but you're probably going to be struggling to get good results below 15 degrees altitude as probably the minimum. And then if you do have an object that's low, right, it's not going to have very many days of the year that it's well positioned at night to be at its best. So you really, for those low objects in the low south, for those of us in the northern hemisphere, plan your dates so that you can maximize the dates when it's highest in the sky. The moon phase, kind of is what it is, but for some objects it matters more than others. And somewhat counterintuitively, the best time to image a given object may not be equally centered on either side of the new moon. Some objects you want to be a little bit closer to the first quarter, some a little bit closer to last quarter. And then finally, I try to sum all this up in my books with the concept of quality imaging hours by setting thresholds here and saying that this can help you optimize your imaging by telling you for a given date when the sun is going to be low enough that it's truly dark, and when the object that you're talking about is going to be high enough to capture quality data. So that's what it's all about. I'm happy to answer questions now, and certainly if people want to reach out afterward, or you'd like to order a copy of the print book or a copy of a custom version of the book, you can reach out to me here, and you can see my website. It's really just my blog at digitalstars.wordpress.com.
Okay, cool. We do have one question from John. Would you comment, are sky glow filters any help for moon glow, or is there something better?
So sky glow filters are not going to help you with moon glow because moon glow is broadband. So it is a reflection of the sun's light, and it is fully broadband. And sky glow filters are designed to filter out the most common wavelengths of light by artificial lighting, like sodium vapor light, although that's becoming less effective with LEDs. I will say it does bring up an important point, though, that for narrowband imaging, when you look up at the sky during the day, you can see that it's blue. And that's a result of both the broadband emission of the sun, but also the scattering effect of Rayleigh scattering. And so most people find that on a night where the moon is out, which is essentially showing reflected sunlight in the sky, that for narrowband imaging, you will typically get better data from your sulfur and hydrogen filters on those nights, because those are on the red side of the spectrum, and the light pollution from the moon is effectively blue-ish, like the daytime sky. And so oxygen is not going to look as good. It's going to be more polluted than sulfur and hydrogen, because oxygen is in the cyan part of the spectrum. So the way to overcome this that a lot of people find is that you buy if you have to spend your money on one really premium super narrow band filter, and you want to get that 3 nanometer filter, do it with the oxygen, because that'll allow you to cut through the moonlight better if you're narrowband imaging. But that was a long-winded way of answering the general question, which is no, a light pollution filter will not help with broadband light pollution like the moon.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, is there anything else you wanted to say? There aren't, as far as I can tell, any questions right now. We are going to go into a different topic in a second, just to introduce the workshop that'll be coming up pretty soon. So Linda is complimenting on your presentation. You guys can keep sending in questions. We'll still be on the air for another 5 minutes or more, depending on how this goes.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, I am going to screen share my entire screen. Share it. This is what we get to look at while we're trying to. We've got over here on the right side. We've got whatever our presentation is actually showing, and then on the left side of the screen, we've got we're trying to monitor both Rumble Talk and the presentation that is coming out. But where I want to go is, this is our website. And and you've seen this. This is where you start your show every night. And for years, it's had upcoming shows, past shows, and all that other stuff. And you can see this upcoming shows thing has been pretty thick lately. We've got things scheduled. We've got a couple of people in here and here that we think we know who's going to go in there, but we don't have them nailed down quite yet. And as you can see, with Charles is tonight, Bill's coming in next week. I won't be here next week, so I'll miss y'all next week. Got to go to a wedding. And then we got a number of other people coming in. So you're always welcome to go there. But you've never seen this little bugger over here. It's called the workshop. Okay. We are going to have a workshop, and right now it's scheduled for June 9th. And you notice that the presenter is you guys, and you are going to be presenting how you processed some data. Eric has given us some data, and you can go here and click on it. We're going to go there in a minute, and Eric's going to tell us a little bit about the data. But this is a TAIC processing workshop. You remember a while back we did the NGC 7000, the wall, and I posted some data, and you guys were all free to download it and process it as you like, and then make your suggestions as to how it should be processed. And we got no two pictures were alike, even though we started with the same data. Well, Eric's given us a bunch of really good quality data, and we'll download it, and we'll look at the downloading in a minute. And then you give it your best shot at processing, and then you fill in this stuff down here under comments, for instance. You tell us how you processed it. Yeah, we're going to look for the people that used Photoshop and PixInsight, but we're also going to look at the people who are using maybe some other pieces of software that we don't always use, or somebody who's using a different technique than most of us are using, and maybe some people who are just flat out going to be doing it the way that we've already done it before, but they did a particularly good job, and we want them to show us how they did it. So you're asked to share those comments here. This email will not show up under your posting, but you're going to upload your picture, tell us your name, give us your email, and show the comment. And your picture will show up on something kind of like the Image of the Week did. And so we'll have a gallery of everybody as how they process this particular workshop. Your private email won't show up there. And your comment will be the information you give us about how you've processed everything. With that in mind, Eric, unmute yourself because you're about to talk. If I click on workshop data right now, I should go to the box file. And Eric, you ready?
I'm here.
Okay. Tell us what we got.
So why don't you open up that folder?
The XI. Okay, either one.
So we have a fairly common target here, the Orion Nebula, but it's really interesting because information extends all the way out and fills a complete field of view. So the data you have here is some longer exposure data for RGB and then hydrogen alpha in order to get some detail and bring out some of the red color in the nebula. But also, if you make these longer exposures, in this case, I think there is some 10-minute exposures, then the core will be blown out and you won't get the trapezium. So you see some of these are labeled either short or core. And those are very short, a number of very short exposures that have been stacked up, which allow you to get to trapezium and the color of the area around the trapezium. So the challenge really is to process the wider field to get all the nebulosity and color, and then to integrate that with the trapezium area, in this case, the core or the short exposures for the hydrogen alpha. And that's kind of the challenge. And in some ways, it's easy to do because the wider field will kind of jump off your screen at you. But to integrate the core and get the trapezium and get an appropriate color for the trapezium that integrates with the wide field is a little bit of a challenge. So that's the data that's up there. If you look on my AstroBin site, you can see what I did with it, but you may have another interpretation. And we have both the FITS and the XISF files for PixInsight. So download either one you want to work with. They're really both the same data.
Now, let's say you're not an advanced processor. There are those of us who aren't advanced processors and can't get everything there is to get out of the data. Well, this is very nice data. Go ahead and process it anyway. Even if all you're doing is the LRGB, go for it and see what you get. Okay, and take it from there. Well, I guess there isn't an L in this pile. Anyway, my point being, process it, you know, and send it on up. And the way you send it up is, as I was pointing earlier, to don't go into Cloudy Nights forum. There we go. Just click on this workshop thing. This red link is where you download the data, and you just upload your picture, and tell us who you are, how you did it, and this email will not show up in your on that page. Okay, do that, and do it relatively soon, because what we want to do is we'll be contacting some people and saying, hey, can you present a little bit? And we'll need to show you how to present and a few other things. Presenting is not hard to do, but you do want to, you know, get ready for it before showtime a little bit. So that's a new effort we're going to have. We're also, as you know, we also have lay dormant the image of the week processing that, or image of the week that we used to have. And this is my data here from the last time we did this this adventure of having people process the data. So you might want to try your own effort at that. But anyway, we used to give out an image of the week on a regular basis, and it made for a beautiful gallery because your submissions were all in here. Whoops, I missed that, I think. But at any rate, my point is, Eric we've figured out how to do the image of the week, we think, and so we'll be, you know, start submitting your images again. Now that's on that's some upcoming stuff. The workshop you want to know about, and start submitting your image of the week. Also changing on the Astro Imaging channel. We want you to start using YouTube every now and then. Not everybody, not all the time. We don't even know if we want to go to the YouTube comment section. We just want to try it out and see what's happening there. Oh, I've got to get out of here and come back over here and stop sharing my screen. And whoa, that's
one thing I want to say is that you know, subscribe to the channel, hit the little notification bell over there so that you'll get notified when we publish a new video. We're going to be doing really cool stuff coming up later.
Yeah. Okay. Have we gotten, where's my Rumble chat? And have we gotten new, what format? JPEG? Oh, please tell Charlie to come back. Come back, Charlie. Charlie's
Happy
still here,
to.
by the way. Yeah, he's still here. And Greg, when you're asking how to upload, just a JPEG is fine for uploading. Just your decent quality JPEG could go back up. The data itself, as you saw, is in both XISF and in TIFF. TIFF for those who don't use the PixInsight. Okay. Where are we all together, guys? We about to ready? No, we don't have any more questions for we don't have any more questions for Charlie. So I think now it's time to say goodnight to all our friends and family.
So next week we have Bill Long, who's going to be presenting about the Voyager software. The Voyager is an automation software similar to many others. So he's not the owner of the company, he's just a user. So we're going to be getting a perspective of a user.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And we will see you next week at 6:30 or 9:30, or depending on where you are. Bye-bye.